of three sections. The main two-story section in beige here is at the right. The pink portion at the left forward was actually built somewhat earlier in Hopeton, a village about 2 miles west of Dresden. The village of Hopeton failed, as villages sometimes did in those days. So one winter, its buildings were loaded up on sleds and pulled downhill to Dresden. And there it was added on to an existing building. So then the rearmost, the lean-to portion in green, was added on site. Now there's one more bit of strangeness. The front and rear portions, you can see they have different roof pitches. And if you follow the roof line very carefully on the left side of the picture, you can see where the angle of the roof changes very slightly. That's where the little house from Hopeton and the lean-to addition were butted together. There's an additional strangeness, aside from this button not working. There we are. Sometime after Ingersol's birth, the entire house was picked up and moved about 500 feet northwest, kitty corner, across an intersection. So the house is where Ingersol was born, but it's not located exactly where it was when he was born. Where we think he was really born, there's a very nice manufactured house that I believe is owned by Dresden's Baptist Church, where Ingersol is frequently preached against. But I digress. Well, by 1876, when the photo that you're not seeing was taken, come along, little machine, there we are. Ingersol was a very well-known figure, a household word around the country, much admired by atheists and freethinkers, and listened to with respect by many others, including those who violently disagreed with him. Well, freethought publications of the time often carried pictures of the Ingersol birthplace, even though it was still being used as a minister's residence. Now here's an early postcard, probably circa 1910 or so. A few years before Ingersol's death in 1899, the church at Dresden was reorganized and it no longer needed a minister's residence. So the house was sold into the private housing market. It had no running water, no indoor plumbing, no electric lighting, and in Dresden, circa turn of the 20th century, that was about par for the course. Well, after Ingersol's death, the Ingersoll family purchased the house. In 1921, it opened as a community house with electric lights, still without running water or indoor plumbing. The house was open to the public for about 7 years. This is an interior view of one of the rooms where we now have the museum gift shop. Sometime before 1930, the money ran out. The house was boarded up and it began to deteriorate. Now this is Joseph Lewis, America's most visible atheist activist in the 1940s and 1950s. In the early 1950s, he determined to restore and reopen the birthplace. Now this photo from the early 1950s, let's try this photo, shows two freethinkers from nearby Rochester, New York, inspecting the shuttered house on Lewis's behalf. Now this is Arthur and Ruth Cromwell. Their daughter, Vashti Cromwell McCullum, would become the plaintiff in the first of the great 20th century decisions on separation of church and state before the U.S. Supreme Court. In fact, the McCullum decision had already occurred at the time this photo was taken. Well, Lewis restored the house and reopened it as a museum in 1954. It operated for about 6 years, and then once again the money ran out. The collection was dispersed to collectors all across the country, and the house began to deteriorate. And as we've seen in the video, when we purchased it in 1986, it was in pretty terrible shape. Well, in restoring the building, we installed the first running water and the first flush toilet the building had ever known. The Robert Green Ingersoll Birthplace Museum opened to the public in 1993. So this means that this year we'll be in our 14th year, and that means that the Council for Secular Humanism has now operated the birthplace open to the public for a longer span of years than the first and second restorations combined. That and $4 will buy you something at Starbucks, but I digress. Well, here are a few items to look for when you visit the museum, if you opt to do so. There we are. When you enter the house, you'll go down a hallway and turn into what was once the living room. And there we have a great number of displays about Ingersoll's life and times. You'll see Ingersoll's own Masonic sword. Though Ingersoll was an atheist, his standing in the community was so great that the usually theistic Masons welcomed him as a member anyway. You'll see some of the gems of the personal collection of our founding library director, the late Gordon Stein. This is an actual copper printing plate that was used to print one of those inexpensive paperback booklets of Ingersoll's speech, Crimes Against Criminals. This was one of the famous Little Blue books, sold nationwide by the Freethought publisher Emanuel Haldeman Julius in the early to middle 20th century. Now, Ingersoll was a penultimate family man to the point that it drove his religious detractors crazy. They were always trying to dig up dirt on him and never could. But Ingersoll did have a few vices. He endorsed a brand of whiskey and 2 brands of cigars. For one of them, he proposed a slogan: "Smoke in this world, not the next." But the biggest thing you'll see in the front room, and probably, truth to tell, the first thing you'd notice, is this 530-pound bust. As noted in the video, this bust of Ingersoll decorated the Beckwith Theater, a lavish structure all out of proportion to the small town of Dowagiac, Michigan. Now, let me tell you a little story about Dowagiac, Michigan. It was a small town whose principal industry was a very successful company that manufactured wood stoves. The owner of that company was a gentleman named Philo T. Beckwith, who happened not to believe in God. Now, perhaps you're starting to notice a connection here. Mr. Beckwith decided that Dowagiac needed the best theater in any small town in the United States, and he took a chunk of his fortune and commenced building it. Promptly died. His children finished it, and the theater was actually inaugurated by Ingersoll. And those figures up across the top here, these little stone medallions, Voltaire is up there, Mary Shelley, and Ingersoll, of course. Let's see if we can get the magic arrow up there. All right. Ingersoll was right there. Now, just to the right of the building's central pediment where you see it. Now, when the theater was demolished in 1968, the Ingersoll bust was thought to have been destroyed. In fact, one witness had seen it fall out of its sling. They were trying to bring the medallions down intact. The Ingersoll medallion fell out of its sling and debris went everywhere. And the assumption was that it had simply been destroyed. Well, in fact, it had been damaged. It was slated to be taken away, but we later found out an enterprising area freethinker managed to take it home. Chipped chin, broken nose and all, it decorated his backyard for more than 30 years. Well, Roger Greeley, the chair of the Robert Greene Ingersoll Memorial Committee, lives in Michigan. One day his phone rang, and it was the old freethinker saying, "Hey, you know that bust of Ingersoll nobody could ever account for? It's in my backyard. You want it?" Well, Roger, that's him in the blue overalls, persuaded a sculptor to restore the damage and deliver the bust to the museum. And it was dedicated in 2001. And that was the occasion of the last big Ingersoll conference that we had down in the Finger Lakes. Well, the next major room focuses on Ingersoll's public life, his death, and the world's reaction to him. There's also material on the history of the house. In the display cases, you'll see memorabilia, including Ingersoll's personal walking stick, and we even have Ingersoll kitsch. This silver